All right, it's recording in the Lira cloud. All right, so, oh, thank you. All right, I see the little chat. All right, okay, so yeah, we basically just now mentioned about the sequence of presenting and the format. Presenters about 12 to 15 minutes and discussion. So yeah, so I will leave the floor or leave the screen to Bryce right now.
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen here. There we go, full screen. All right, so thank you everyone for being here. I'm gonna be talking about, my name is Bryce VanderBerg. I'll be talking about my paper, The Signaling Role of Early Career Job Loss today. And so just to kind of set the stage a little bit as by way of introduction, it's been well established that involuntary job loss leads to really long-term earnings losses. And this goes back to work by Jacobson, Lalonde, and Sullivan in 1993, who used administrative data from the state of Pennsylvania and found that at the time workers are laid off, they had this huge initial earnings drop, but then it persists for years and years, even after we might assume that the worker has had an opportunity to get back into the labor force. And while their work and other work that's followed using administrative data doesn't tend to look specifically at young workers aren't immune to this. There's evidence that they also experience similar, though slightly less persistent effects. And a big question that comes out of this that researchers have been looking at for a long time is why exactly do these effects persist? And recent evidence by Wachowska, Moss, and Woodbury suggests that a big part of this could be due to lost specific human capital and good quality job matches. Now, this isn't necessarily directly applicable to young workers because they're less established in the labor market. In this study in particular, they require that workers have a minimum of 6 years of tenure on the job in order to be counted among their displaced worker sample. And one of the things we know about young workers is that they're highly mobile. So in order for them to hit that 6 years of tenure mark, not only do they have to be in the labor market for at least 6 years, but chances are it's an even higher bar because they're moving between jobs. So in looking at younger workers, an alternative explanation might be more applicable. And in this case, what I'm looking at is what's the role of incomplete information about a worker's ability when they first enter the labor market. And kind of to motivate this idea, we know that employers are gradually learning about workers over time, and that a current employer is going to learn faster than prospective employers. Given that information asymmetry, it makes sense that if employers can choose who they're going to lay off, they're going to lay off their worst workers first. And that's going to send some sort of signal, or possibly send a signal to a prospective employer that says, hey, this worker might not be as good as someone else, and that's going to show up in wages. Now, to look at this idea, I'm going to use data from our National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, the 1997 cohort, to examine the extent to which ability signaling explains or contributes to long-term wage losses for these young workers. And I'm going to use, or the data allow me to document the nature of job loss and include measures of cognitive ability, which are these AFQT scores, to sort of pick up whether or not there appears to be some role for ability and learning in understanding these effects. So what do these effects look like, first off? So this figure basically just shows the coefficients from a very simple event study design that's typically used in the displaced worker literature. And what we see is that at the point of job loss, wages drop by about 10% or so for all workers who are laid off. And while there's some slight recovery, they still are about 5% lower than non-job losers, even 6 years after a layoff. So these are still fairly sizable effects. Now, as I said, I want to sort of look at this by ability level. And I'm going to use two different measures of ability right off the bat to kind of motivate the more broader conceptual framework that I'll get to in a second. The first is these raw AFQT scores. An AFQT score is a measure of cognitive ability that was designed by the US military to test basically the aptitude of new enlistments, and they partnered with the NLS to kind of use the NLSY cohort as a test group for various samples. And it's been shown over the years to be at least a decent rough measure of cognitive ability. And so on the left side, I'm using the raw AFQT scores, and I'm just looking at what are the effects of job loss by whether a worker has above or below average of one of these scores. And basically what you see on the left is that there's no real difference between those with a high score or those with a low score. If anything, those with a high score appear like they may experience slightly worse effects, but there's no real big difference. And this kind of makes sense, right? Because there's evidence from other literature that like a worker's education is going to affect how their losses, earnings losses after layoff are driven. And basically there's a lot of things that are correlated with these scores. They're going to kind of muddy the role of ability in explaining its effects. So to try to pull out those other confounding effects, what I do is I create residual AFTT scores, which are basically the residual from a regression of an AFTT score on observable characteristics like education, age, race, gender, etc. And the idea here is to pull out any information about a worker that employers should be able to gain when the worker first enters the labor market, and so that what's left over is what they're learning about. And what we see with this figure is that at the time of job loss, earnings or wage losses are almost identical for the two groups. And that stays the same for a few years, but starting about 4 years after job loss, we see this dramatic divergence to the point where 6 years post layoff, workers with above average residual AFTT scores have fully recovered, while those with below average scores have basically been flat. Their wages persist at about 10% lower. And so what I'm going to do here then is argue that this makes sense under a layoff signaling sort of scenario. And to do that, I'm going to kind of walk you through real quick, just a really brief conceptual framework. So the idea here is that workers enter the labor market with some level of unobserved ability and a vector of observable production-related characteristics. Employers then are going to use these observed characteristics to infer something about the worker's ability early in their career. So if I see you would have a high level of education, I'm going to assume that you have a higher level of ability. Then over time, employers are going to use sort of private and production-related signals to learn about how far a worker's ability is from what they expect it to be, given the observable characteristics. And then so an outside employer is going to be able to observe whether a current employer chose to lay off a worker, and that's going to tell them something about the worker's ability under the idea that a current employer is going to desire to lay off the worst workers first. Now, this need not be accurate for all workers because we know there's other reasons why workers might get laid off, such as first in or last in, first out policies, or perhaps they just weren't a bad job match. So that's going to make this signal really kind of a noisy signal. And then on top of that, since outside employers are learning something throughout a worker's career, the longer a worker is in the labor market before being laid off, the less informative a layoff signal is going to be, because a prospective employer doesn't need to rely on it. And so what we end up with is kind of a wage growth path that looks something like this. So we have two workers that, after accounting for everything that's observable by outside employers, look pretty much identical up to the point of being laid off. But there's a difference between them because what's sort of their actual ability, netting out what's observed, one of them has higher or above average ability, one of them has below average. Now, if they weren't to be laid off, over time, their wages would gradually diverge and hit these points, DP and DN. But because they're both laid off, they both get assigned this negative layoff signal, and so both their wages drop down to point B. For the higher above average relative ability worker, this is clearly a negative signal. And so what's going to happen then is, as more time passes after the worker is laid off, employers are going to get even more information, and they're going to correct their initial inaccurate beliefs, and we're going to see a really steep earnings recovery for that worker after a few years. On the lower ability worker, on the other hand, is basically going to have relatively flat wages because for them, the signal is fairly accurate. So there's no reason to expect that they would have a sizable recovery. And this kind of makes sense with what we saw earlier. The below average workers had pretty flat, stable earnings losses or wage losses, while the above average workers eventually saw a pretty dramatic recovery. That said, there's a lot of potential reasons why we might see something like this unrelated to signaling. The difference here is that, as I mentioned, the size of the signal is going to depend on how long a worker's in the labor market. So this lambda term, which is going to pick up the initial signaling effect, is getting smaller and smaller as experience increases. So empirically, to account for that, I'm going to pull from this literature on empirical employer learning developed by Farber and Gibbons and Altanji and Perret, where they basically run a log wage regression of the following form, where they regress wages on observable characteristics such as years of schooling, experience, the AFQT score, and other characteristics. And what they do is they look at this coefficient on the interaction of experience and AFQT score and look to see that it's growing, or that the return to AFQT score is growing with time in the labor market. And this is meant to pick up something about how employers are learning about the worker. And so what I'm kind of arguing is that under the scenario where layoffs are signaling something about the worker, basically this learning path that is found in this other model is going to be interrupted. And so what I do is I include the following additions to that sort of regression to account for this discrete change. So the interaction of a layoff indicator and the AFQT score is meant to account for this initial disproportionate effect by workers' ability. And then interacting that again with post experiences is meant to pick up that steep earnings recovery that we saw in that previous figure. Now, both of these interactions are then interacted again with pre-event or pre-layoff experience. The idea here again being that the longer workers in the labor market, the less of there should be, the less or the smaller the signal should be. So basically, the layoff interacted with AFQT score and pre-event experience picks up how the initial signal is shrinking, and then this quadruple interaction picks up how the kind of post-layoff recovery path is flattening out, because you don't need to correct an inaccurate belief if you don't have that inaccurate belief to begin with. And so just running running this regression, the relevant column that we're interested here is column 5. And the big things to take away here are that, well, one, all the coefficients are what we would hope to see. There's this big initial negative effect, followed by a really steep earnings recovery, which is about 4 times larger in magnitude than the return to ability was for the non-laid off workers, which again is what we'd expect. We'd expect it to be larger because it's not only picking up learning about their ability, but it's correcting an inaccurate belief. And then both of these effects are decreasing in magnitude with pre-event experience, which again backs up kind of this sort of signaling theory that says the more information they have about a worker before they're laid off, the less signaling should matter. So that I will leave it there. Sorry, that's just the appendix slide. So thank you.
That's perfect timing. All right. Do we have a discussion coming here?
Yes. So I'll just I'll just rattle off my comments, and then I guess Bryce, you could kind of pick your what you react to. So first of all, it's good to see the Conlins acknowledged on your paper. So the Conlins and I overlapped at Syracuse like 2 decades ago. So you're in good hands. I'll say that first. My second thought here is that I like this paper because it gives my labor economics students some hope, because I hit them with this idea, and it's really bad during a recession where it's like, hey, you guys are going to be penalized because you're in a recession, and you're going to be penalized over your lifetime. So if everybody's laid off for a downturn or something like that, it gives them some hope that if they're of high ability, that there's not much scarring, right? 5-6 years and it goes away. So they'll be happy to hear that. So my first thought here is that when we think about the distribution of ability for displaced versus non-displaced workers, it's obviously not the same, right? And so when I think about this in kind of like a diff and diff or event study, I'm a little worried that so starting with like BK's assumption, where low ability individuals are the first to get laid off. So now if we're comparing displaced and non-displaced, we have more low ability individuals in the displaced than in the non-displaced, and then high ability the other way around. So I guess I was looking for a little bit more kind of just clear-cut defense of that, maybe some sample sizes, just to, a couple cells here and there, cell sizes that take that out of my brain. The bigger thought here, though, is that I wonder, is the speed of employer learning the same for displaced and non-displaced? So what I'm picturing here is perhaps, I don't know if this is true, it's just a hypothetical, but is there more monitoring of the displaced than the non-displaced, and therefore a higher speed of learning for that group? Because if so, that might be part of the quick recovery for high ability individuals, is that they're being monitored more. That was just a thought. And that relates to kind of the weight that employers put on the layoff signal. And then my final thought is, I wonder if contracts, from the employer perspective, could contracts be constructed in a way to place less risk of kind of a layoff higher, take the risk from the employer and kind of put it on the worker? I'm not sure what that contract would look like, but I kind of had thoughts about that, because I would start with the assumption that that's currently not being done.
So first off, thank you. And that last comment on contracts is probably something Mike Conlon would really be, through the roof about. And actually, so it wasn't, well, he were there, but my undergrad was at Syracuse, so I upstate New York is represented. So I'll just real quick hit on, I guess, probably just the first comment real quick. You're right, the distributions are different, and for the regular event study design, that is a problem. And that's why I'm currently going through trying to rewrite the paper. So I want those graphs to be more descriptive than anything else. So I'm not trying to say that those graphs are causal. In fact, I'm trying to explicitly say that the event study design shouldn't be what we just rely on, for that very reason, that the samples are different. And then when I get to the sort of the more employer learning type model, the idea is that the way employers are learning is meant to try to account for these differences. And so in that case, the model is really being identified by the fact that, yeah, the sample is going to skew toward the low ability side for the laid off workers, but the high ability workers are still there. So that's what's going to drive that big recovery for those workers. And so I'm trying to get away from relying on the assumption that we can compare one group to the other, and instead say, let's just look at how the return to ability itself is driving some of these effects.
Any questions from the audience? Okay, we're close to the time. I have a very quick one, Bryce, and I saw you used a lot of different layers of the interaction, right? So typically, if you have the interact with the same variable and you have several layers of interactions, you will run into the problem of multicollinearity. Have you checked that?
So you mean like having the interaction of like post experience, then post and pre experience?
Mm-hmm. And AFQT itself is also.
So there would be issues with multicollinearity if they were picking up this. So I guess as a first bit, yeah, they all are correlated in some way. I guess what I'm specifically assuming here is that the parts of these variables that aren't correlated are sufficiently different, and those are what are, I guess, leading to the effects. So when we're looking at how the return to post layoff experience interacted with ability, how that changes with pre-layoff experience, there's sufficient variation with pre-layoff experience that it's not completely just giving us a really sort of inaccurate estimate, I guess. I haven't dug into the econometrics a ton on that, but that, yeah, that's something I should be more clear about, I guess. Thank you.
All right. Okay, let's move on to the paper number 2. Thank you so much, Bryce from Michigan State University. Very interesting paper. Next is Joseph.
Let's see here.
Yep, it shows up very nicely.
Okay, great. So this paper is titled First to 15. It's involving Alberta's minimum wage policy, looking at kind of 3 different cuts by wages, ages, and places, employment effects only. This work is done with Sebastian Fossati, who's basically the econometrician on the paper, and I'm the labor economist. So a bit of the local history behind the policy is that think of Alberta as kind of the Texas of Canada, so to speak. So following 44 consecutive years of Conservative Party rule here, the New Democratic Party formed Alberta's only one-term government for 4 years. Basically, due to party vote splitting on the Conservative side, we had a kind of a Tea Party political party known as the Wild Rose here during that kind of that middle 20-teens period. And basically, the Conservative vote was split between those 2 Conservative parties in that election. And so the NDP basically won a surprise election. So for the minimum wage in Alberta, prior to the NDP winning, the province had set up a formula-based approach a couple of years beforehand, 4 or 5 years beforehand, that was based equally on changes to annual average weekly earnings, which matters a lot in this province because we have these big energy booms here, which really increase earnings, as well as the consumer price index, so 50%, 50%. And then the NDP basically threw in to their election platform this idea of a $15 minimum wage. And there were really no other details. So if you go to this document, it just says $15 minimum wage. It doesn't even make reference to the existing policies or anything like that. So they have this surprise win of the election, and they push forward this idea of $15 minimum wage, which makes Alberta the first state or province in North America to reach this threshold, which happened just about 3 years ago. So altogether, it was a 47% increase over 3 years in 4 different increments, $1, $1, $1.40, $1.40. And then since 2018, it's just sat at this $15 level. Okay, so more of a broader history is that this North American concept of a $15 minimum wage actually came from where I'm from. So shout out to New York again. So it came from the city level, New York City, in 2012 as this Fight for 15 movement among a very specific group. So fast food workers in New York City. And they actually wouldn't win their fight for another 6 to 7 years. So now they have. But that's basically where it came from. But I guess these 3 words just went so well together that other unions and labor groups had run with it, and it really started to take off. So prior to Alberta, minimum wages at such a nominal level hit Seattle, excuse me, as a city. It hit San Francisco. Later on, it hit a few other cities in California as well, and has since spread to Washington, D.C., New York City's on a phased-in level as well. For city-level analysis, there's this great paper that just came out, Dubin-Lidner, so definitely check that out. But then in terms of states and provinces, Alberta's first. British Columbia just reached this threshold 4 days ago. New York and California will reach this at the turn of the year, and then Connecticut and Massachusetts, Maryland and New Jersey, Illinois, and then Florida. And this is of a couple of months ago, so there might even be some others that have committed to this already. And then We've even had noise and some movement at the national level, again, using this kind of $15 level as the minimum wage. So Canada just put through their budget for 2021 a few months ago. And in it, they said that all federal employees would have a minimum wage of $15. Now, this really, so this is affects about 25,000 people, but almost none of them are at the minimum wage. And so this really isn't binding. It's kind of, you know, just something that kind of follows the language, but won't have much movement in terms of wages. Whereas the US actually, in their last stimulus package, pushed for a $15 level nationally in the US over, I think, 4 or 5 years. And that would have affected close to 27 million workers, according to the CBO. Okay, so for our policy examination of the policy, Newmark suggests 2 things: a valid counterfactual control group for what would have happened absent the increases in the minimum wage, and then a sufficiently sharp focus on potentially affected workers. And we argue that we have both. So for the first, we have a twin province of Saskatchewan that we can use for Alberta. So the economy is pretty much the same. It's based on agriculture. It's based on energy extraction. And interestingly enough, it put forward a formula-based minimum wage approach that was almost exactly as Alberta had, almost exactly at the same time. And then for the sufficiently sharp focus on potentially affected workers, we do 3 different cuts by wages, ages, places. The wage bin approach is similar to the literature. And then this other paper finds that the age is one of the strongest predictors of an affected worker, with rural or places, as we're using it, being the 5th most important factor. Okay, so here's our twins, Alberta and Saskatchewan, their minimum wages over time. So as I said, they had very similar policies, formula-based policies, starting around here, 2009, 2010. And you can see that these moved kind of in lockstep with one another up until this change in 2015, where Alberta takes off and Saskatchewan very much just stays on the same path. BC and Ontario are another set of comparisons that we use. They were also pretty close to the same levels as Alberta and Saskatchewan early on. That said, BC had this big increase in their movement to $15, as did Ontario, but interestingly, they never reached a $15 minimum wage. They actually stopped $1 short. That said, they have the a record, I guess, of having the largest nominal minimum wage increase in 1 year. So they had this big jump of over $2 in 2018, but then they never reached the $15 threshold, whereas BC is now sitting at $15.20 as of 2021. Okay, so most of the studies in the minimum wage literature look at very small changes rather than this large, quick, and very unexpected with the political change in Alberta. We also adopt, so that's kind of the strength of our setup, is that we have this large, quick, and unexpected change, and at the state level where we're the first one, so there aren't existing examples. We use synthetic control methods to explore what would have happened, fill in the counterfactual for Alberta without the policy. Now, this is not new to the literature, but it is new, and you might know of these pair of Seattle studies, for example, at the city level, but we're the first to use synthetic control for a state level policy of the $15 minimum wage, and we use specifically the Bayesian structural time series approach. Okay, so we need to identify relevant untreated control units. So we basically split the wage bins up into each of these increases that Alberta followed. So we use this as a comparison, Saskatchewan's employment within these wage bins versus Alberta, basically. Also as a comparison, we use Alberta's employment level for those earning more than $20 because they wouldn't be affected by this policy or not expected to. And then regularized priors. We use a pre-intervention sample of 8 years before the policy and a post-intervention sample of 4 years, which puts us kind of pre-COVID. So we won't want to look past what we already do. And we're using labor force survey data. It's all publicly available, but the wage bin cuts were actually through a government of Alberta request in my my work for them as chair of their minimum wage expert panel. So the age cuts are basically young versus everyone else. And then the geographic cuts, we have 7 economic regions. 2 are going to be urban, Calgary and Edmonton, and then 7, that should be 5 non-urban. Okay, let's go to the results. So I basically have 3 pictures to show you here. So this is the first. This is the wage bin cuts. And the top panel is employment for those earning $11.20 or below. So basically, once we start our minimum wage to $15 path here and jump to $11.20 and then to $12.20, $13.60, and then $15, we would expect that employment in this bin of $11.20 or below to go to 0. And that's exactly what we see happening here. So the blue is the counterfactual, and then the black is what's actually happening in Alberta. And we can see that in Alberta, that employment in that wage bin is basically going to 0. It's not exactly 0, so there's a little noise there, but almost 0. And then one of my favorite pictures of the paper is this one. So what we do is we look at employment in the 2 middle wage bins. So $11.20 to $12.20 and then $12.20 to $13.60. And we say, well, what's happening to employment in that bin as we go through these 4 annual changes? And what you'll see is that employment grows in these middle 2 bins over the first 2 increases from $11.20 to $12.20, which makes perfect sense. But then as it moves to $13.60, you'd expect that employment then goes to 0 for these 2 wage bins. And that's exactly what we see. For the age cuts, we would expect that this is mainly going to affect younger workers, namely teenagers, but also early 20s. So that's straight from the literature. So if we look at everybody but the young workers, we do not see any difference between what's happening in Alberta and what's happening in the counterfactual. Whereas for young workers, we see that they're the same through these 8 years before the policy change, and even through the first increment of a $1 increase to the minimum wage, but not so much after. So the counterfactual kind of continues upward, and then you can see this big deviation of Alberta. So employment losses for the young. And then lastly, for our geographic cuts, if we look at employment in Calgary and Edmonton, there's basically no difference between what's happening in Alberta and what's happening in our counterfactual through these 4 increments. Whereas if we look in the 5 other economic regions, we do see a statistically different loss. And the size of the employment loss is actually the same, almost 25,000, whether we look by young workers or whether we look by non-urban, which is quite interesting and was quite exciting to me and my co-author, because when this policy was first initiated, I used elasticities from the existing literature, and I said that the employment loss was going to be about 25,000. I got skewered for saying that in the press, but the data bore that out since then. Okay, so just to wrap up, Alberta is the first state or province with a $15 minimum wage. Many $15 minimum wage policies are to follow. The main results are workers moved up the wage distribution bin by bin. Employment losses were found for the young and those outside the two main cities. But we got to say that the job losses were relatively modest given how large, quick, and unexpected the increases were. And then if you'd like to see the paper, it's up on the Ideas Network.
All right. Thank you so much, Joseph. That was a presentation from Joseph from University of Alberta. So Kathleen, do you want to discuss the paper? Oh, you're muted. We cannot hear you. You're not muted, but we cannot hear you somehow. Okay. In the meantime, anybody else has any questions? Right. Kathleen, yeah, you want to try your audio again? We still cannot hear you. We should have tried that earlier. Okay, Kathleen probably won't re-log in. All right. Yeah. So anybody had any questions on Joseph's paper or comments?
I was just so I'm from Canada, and what I remembered was when after Alberta did that big increase, they got hit pretty shortly after by the big oil kind of crisis around there. And I guess maybe it's my stereotype, but I just think of Saskatchewan as mostly farming. How comparable are Saskatchewan and Alberta in terms of dependence on oil? Like how much of it do you think could be just explained by Alberta's reliance on the oil industry and the kind of crash in prices that they had shortly after the increase?
Yeah, so two things to say here. So one is that because we have the 4 years, the first 2 years that wasn't happening, but then in the second 2 years it was, right? And so you could think that, all right, maybe that's going to play into the larger effects in the second 2 years. So that's why I like this approach of using the economic regions, because I'd say on the whole, I completely buy that Saskatchewan is not exactly the twin to Alberta economically, but when you break it down to economic regions, their southern and western economic regions that have the oil very much look like our oil regions. And so given that they have kind of the twin policy plus breaking it down more locally, we argue that it works rather well. However, we do not specifically disentangle the two in that additional 2-year period. Yeah, so I do have to be careful about saying that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, very nice.
Thanks. Sorry about that. No, I just wanted to say I absolutely love this paper. I think it's such a nice application of the synthetic control method. And obviously the $15 minimum wage is a huge issue in US labor policy right now. So as someone who works in the legislative branch of the US government, this is something that is, a big topic, especially in COVID with thinking about wage replacement rates and how, our unemployment insurance compares to minimum wage laws in different states and what kind of behavior that might be incentivizing from a labor supply perspective. So I really think this paper is great. And I think one of the best parts about it for me as working in policy in the United States is that having such a large increase in the minimum wage, 47%, that's on par with what basically doubling the federal minimum wage in the US right now would be. So seeing those effects and how quickly it happened, I think is super informative. And the other thing I really like about the paper is that, it's not surprising to me that the employment effects are negative, but kind of disentangle where and by who, like who's being most effective, I think is a really important part of the policy debate that often is not discussed enough in papers and in just the policy debate. So I think that was great. I noticed that you focus on 25 and under for those who are most likely to be affected by the minimum wage. And that was something, and I know that you said it came from the literature as well, but it's something that's a little bit surprising to me because at least in the US, and I'm definitely ignorant about a lot of aspects of the the Canadian economy. So, but in the US, over half of minimum wage workers are over 25. I think I looked it up yesterday. I think it's about 57%, according to BLS, of minimum wage workers are over 25. So I would just put that into context in the paper. Just give us a sense of what percentage of minimum wage workers really do fall into that age bracket, because that's something that just came into my mind quickly. I also have the same comment that Reed had about the oil in Alberta. My dad used to work for Shell, so he told me all about Edmonton back in the day. I noticed another thing that I just want to point out. I noticed that you guys follow a lot of Carl Nadler's work on the Seattle minimum wage. Carl Nadler's actually just joined GAO. So when I saw that, we're excited. That was great, because that's exactly the paper that he presented when he applied to work with us. And I really like the robustness checks. I think given the difficulty of imposing the synthetic control in kind of a state context, I think it's much harder and kind of gets at more of the issue of the Card-Kruger, Pennsylvania versus New Jersey kind of debate that we still have to this day. So I really liked all those robustness checks. I think that was really important. One question I did have was, you talk about kind of the employers complied with the minimum wage increases. I mean, was that something that was unexpected or a surprise? So that's one kind of question I have. I'm not sure, to what extent these things are enforced in different countries. Like I said, consider the robustness checks a little bit more about the age bins, given that minimum wage workers can be over 25, at least in the US. And I was wondering if there's also like systematic differences between rural and non-rural areas of Alberta that, could also be to help flush out kind of why we might see the employment effects more in the non-urban areas versus the urban ones. And that was it.
Right. Thanks so much. So I'll be super quick. So to underscore kind of the worry about the energy bust in the latter 2 years is that the non-urban urban split, obviously it's the non-urban areas that have the oil. And so there is kind of a worry there that's what we were picking up. But then if you look at non-urban in Saskatchewan versus non-urban Alberta, we're okay. So to go back to your excitement about the paper, we were really excited to possibly be submitting this paper as the US adopted this policy. And then right at the last minute, we lost it. And so it was like, oh man, that's like a guaranteed acceptance. Oh, now I'm forgetting your the first question.
About compliance of the minimum wage laws?
Yeah, sorry. So just one last final thought about that. So I was, the government of Alberta made me chair of a minimum wage expert panel that had kind of equal representation of kind of workers and employers. So this was language that I used in the report to kind of bridge the gap between employers and workers, kind of giving some credit to employers to say, hey, they went along with this. Did I think that they weren't going to? No. So it's just kind of neutral language that I try to walk throughout the paper, but it basically came from that panel work.
That makes sense.
Thanks so much.
All right, very nice discussion here. Yeah, thank you so much, Kathleen. You mentioned the age concern and also comments, which is very nice. Also bridge very well to your paper. Now it's your turn.
Sounds good. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my presentation?
It's coming. Yep, we can see it now.
Great. So our work is called Income Inequality and Work in Older Ages. My name is Kathleen McQueeney, and I'm a senior economist at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. I've done this work with my colleagues, Michael Collins and Jen Gregory, also at GAO. And this work builds upon a report that we published, I believe I want to say in 2019, definitely in a pre-COVID world. And that work, that GAO report is called Income and Wealth Disparities Continue into Old Age. So we have more work in there. And if you're interested in that report, I would be happy to share it. And the usual disclaimer from government employees, the views expressed herein are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Government Accountability Office. So income and wealth inequality in the United States have increased over the past several decades, as I'm sure you are all aware. And inequality among older Americans specifically has been a big area of concern, given trends related to the US retirement system over the same period. So for instance, we've shifted from a primarily defined benefit pension system to a defined contribution system in which, the onus of retirement savings has really shifted from employer to employee over time. And at the same time, we've seen that average life expectancy has increased substantially, which is obviously a positive development, but it also requires more planning to save and support more years in retirement. So taking that all together, the inequality piece and the life expectancy piece, the disparities in income and wealth and life expectancy may be indicative of potential problems for many Americans' financial security in retirement. So sources of financial security in retirement may include Social Security, employer-sponsored pensions and retirement plans, account-based kind of retirement plans, as I spoke about before, personal savings, and then income from work, which is the emphasis of our paper today. So the contribution of this paper is that we ended up using and looking at the distributions of wealth and income amongst a cohort of older Americans as they age, using data from the Health and Retirement Study, which is a survey of older households in the United States. And then we were able to link that survey data to administrative earnings data from the Social Security Administration. And that's important for us because there's been a lot of critiques, especially in US policy, about using data that is self-reported on income. So the fact that we were able to kind of link to a gold standard administrative income data from SSA was a big contribution of this paper. We also aim to examine the relationship between work at older ages and the distribution of wealth, income, and longevity, and kind of link those two discussions. And then we also make some methodological contributions around linking that HRS data to the SSA data, which is not always a one-for-one linkage. And we did a bunch of stuff around survey weights. I'm not going to talk about that too much today, but if you're interested in that, it's discussed in the paper as well as our public report. In terms of data, we used data from the HRS from 1992 through 2014. And the HRS is a nationally representative longitudinal survey that follows the same set of Americans from their 50s through the remainder of their lives. So when we talk about older Americans in our paper, we're really talking about the 50 plus age cohort. And specifically, we look at one cohort, which is known as the original HRS, if you're familiar with the data. And they were born from 1931 through 1941. And that means that when the survey started in 1992, they were between 51 and 61. And then when our survey kind of period ends, our study ends in 2014, they're between 73 and 83. So they're pretty advanced ages. And because this is a longitudinal survey where they're following the same people over time, these people are re-interviewed every 2 years. So our two, kind of big variables of interest in the paper are obviously wealth and income, given that we're looking at inequality. And wealth is aggregate. And so I just want to make sure we are all on the same page about what wealth and income mean in this context. So wealth is aggregated across all sources of net worth, assets minus liabilities, and includes retirement accounts, real estate, investments, and all kinds of other things. But it does not include the present value of future pension or Social Security benefits. And that's a data limitation of the HRS. Then income is a measure of mid-career earnings. So specifically, we look at the household's average annual reported earnings when the household head was between 41 and 50. And the reason we do this is because it's a relatively stable measure of where households realistically are in the earnings, in the income distribution when they're in their prime working years. So for instance, we do this because we didn't want to pick up somebody who retired early but made a ton of money in their prime working years and are thus kind of higher income than they may seem in terms of the income measure that they would have in retirement. And of course, our household earnings data comes from this linked data from SSA. And then when I talk about wealth and income groups in the presentation, I'm referring to the fact that we broke up these households in the distribution by quintile. So obviously the bottom quintile of wealth or income would be kind of your poorest households, and then the top quintile would be your richest ones. In terms of methodology, the first piece we kind of looked at was the relationship between income and longevity and wealth and longevity, as well as other demographic characteristics. And we did so using a continuous survival analysis. So we did this kind of two ways. One was a univariate world where we just looked at longevity across the different income groups or across different races or education groups, whatever we were looking at. And those were all univariate. But then we also looked at the relationships between all of these things at the same time through multivariate continuous survival analysis regressions to get a sense of what are the factors that are really driving differences in longevity. And then we took that information and we kind of looked at things more descriptively using that longitudinal survey data that allowed us to follow changes for specific individuals as they aged, including their working status over time, as well as their mortality through 2014. So overall, in terms of our results, so not looking by any demographic, but just overall, of the survey respondents that started in 1992 and continued through the survey, an estimated 63% of them were alive in 2014. So that means that over half of our cohort made it to ages 73 to 83. We also found that greater levels of income and wealth were associated with greater longevity, which is not surprising, but I'll get more into those results in a second. And then for most households, the level of wealth was relatively consistent as they aged. And we basically saw this across the wealth distribution. However, disparities in wealth between the first quintile and the fifth quintile, for example, were very strong and persisted over time. But we didn't see the same thing for income. We saw that incomes generally declined as people aged, and that disparity in income between the bottom and the top kind of narrowed as people aged. And the main reason why is because there were decreased earnings from work contributing to the decline as people retired, but that this was concentrated particularly at the top of the income distribution. So in terms of the longevity results, the first thing that we found is that an estimated 48% of individuals from households in the bottom quintile of the wealth distribution, so kind of the poorest households in terms of wealth, were alive in 2014, compared to an estimated 76% of individuals from households in the top quintile. So this is a 28% differential between the bottom and the top in terms of wealth and being alive at the end of the survey period. And these strong disparities in wealth groups remained even after we started controlling for other demographics in our multivariate regressions, including age at the time of survey, sex, race, ethnicity, maximum educational attainment, and self-reported health status. So we did a bunch of robustness checks, but these disparities really remain and are quite strong throughout the survey period. And then for income, I have a nice graphic that I took from the report. And here you can see that the bottom quintiles on your left side, about 52% of those individuals at the bottom of the income distribution were alive at the end of the survey period, compared to 74% at the top. So you still see strong disparities in longevity by income groups, but it's less than what we saw on the wealth side. And you still see the disparities regardless of if you control for other factors. The only difference that goes away at one point is the difference between the fourth and the fifth quintile in terms of longevity. So when you start controlling for other factors, those two groups, there's no a significant difference in longevity between them. But regardless of the disparities that we see, which are pretty striking, we still see that a high proportion of individuals, even at the bottom of the income distribution and the bottom of the wealth distribution, are living well into their 70s, into their 80s, about half of those households. So then looking at the more descriptive information that we have in the report, this is looking at wealth as people age. So it's the same people over time from 1992 to 2014. And the first thing I think you see here is that obviously there's a significant difference between median household wealth in the bottom quintile of the wealth distribution versus the top quintile, and certainly versus all of the upper quintiles. But one thing I think that's quite striking about these graphs is that, there's really not a significant difference in median net worth in 1992 versus 2014 in any of these wealth quintiles. So we don't really see the spend down in wealth that people might expect in terms of like life cycle model or something like that. But income tells a different story. We do see income going down more as people age across the income distribution, although it's less so at the bottom versus the top. But of course, we still see that those disparities in income are there. So then thinking about, resources that people have in retirement and what people's behavior is, we wanted to look more at if people are working and, how many people are there and what are they getting from work. So here's the percent of households with earnings by income quintile as they age. So here you can see that same kind of negative trend across the income distribution. So certainly less households are working overtime in each income quintile, but the difference in kind of the percent of households working is greatest in the top two income groups versus the bottom. And I think what's also interesting is that if you look at the dark green bars, the last bar that represents 2014, the last year of our data, you still see that between 15 and 25% of households are working across these income groups. So that's quite a few people working to very advanced ages in our data. And then in terms of what they're actually making from that work, this is what that looks like in terms of median. So obviously it's lower at the bottom versus the top, but it's still, especially in the middle three quintiles, it's pretty flat, just below $20,000 in terms of a median earnings. So while disparities in longevity exist among older Americans, there are still many low income and low wealth individuals who are still alive at older ages, and you still see quite a few of them working. And I think we think that has a lot of implications for US retirement policy in terms of policies around making it easier for people to work at older ages, as well as ways to improve retirement security. So those are just some things that we've been thinking about from that report. And yeah, I'm happy to hear any comments, questions.
Okay, Bryce is the discussant.
Yep. So just first off, I want to say that I enjoyed reading the paper, especially now that my parents are starting to get closer to that retirement age, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, these things that for a long time as a younger person I didn't really think about at all. It's all of a sudden they're very relevant, and we think that, oh, people are living longer, that's a good thing, but there is this aspect of, well, you have to be able to afford to live longer, basically, and if your retirement savings aren't high enough, or if you're not accounting for the fact that you're going to live longer with your retirement savings, you could end up in a very bad place. And so I guess just some of the comments I had in thinking about the sort of the implications of what you're looking at, one of the things you talk about is that policies to encourage, or at least not discourage, work at these older ages might help with the the inequality between like the wealth and income distributions. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how much would we actually expect it to have a meaningful effect on sort of these disparities, especially given how stable, for instance, like the wealth sort of remains over time as they're getting older. And one thing I was thinking of is, it obviously is just descriptive because these are the workers who are still, the people who are still working at the, by 2014, it's a very selected group, but just seeing sort of how those how the, measures of wealth and income and whatnot changed over time for those specific people, to see if, okay, is working for them actually having sort of a difference in terms of kind of where they're at on the distribution. Obviously, again, it's a really selected sample, so being able to extrapolate anything from there would be problematic, but it might get a sense of, if they're working, are they working, is the reason they're working to help increase, their wealth at retirement so they can live, survive longer, or is, there's something else driving that? Okay, and then another thing I was kind of curious about is, how do differences in the proportion of people in each quintile who are choosing not to, or who are not working prior to entering the sample, so prior to 1992, what kind of role are they playing in this overall analysis? I think the thing that I found most interesting was that among that bottom quintile group, only like 68% were working in 92. So that's like age 51 to 61, only like not even 2/3 are working, or just over 2/3. It just like the reason for why they're not working might be interesting, especially if some of the middle quintile groups might have public sector employees who have taken early out contracts or things like that. That might be worth digging into to see kind of like what's driving some of these more longer run differences, I guess. And then the last thing was just sort of, the first thing you start off with is how wealth affects, longevity. Have you done anything looking at how, wealth affects not only your longevity, but the longevity of your spouse? So if you survive to 2014, I'm assuming that being in a lower quintile means you're less likely to have had a spouse survive to 2014. And that's going to affect household income and wealth, and might contribute to some of these things that you're finding, at least in some way. So that might be worth digging into a little bit. But yeah, that's all I got. I enjoyed reading it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryce. Kathleen, you want to respond?
No, I think those are all great points, especially the one about the lower percentage of people in the first income quintile working, even in 1992, that is so significantly different, especially from the other quintiles. It's something that we want to explore more, for sure. I have a feeling that these are people that have a long-term, more likely to have a long-term disability and things like that. And that's part of the reason why we're seeing that. Yes, the survivorship of spouses and survivorship overall has been a tricky thing to deal with as we're presenting the data. So like, for instance, the wealth piece and longevity, we're only looking at basically wealth in wave one of the survey. So when they enter the survey, where are they at? And then we check the longevity from there. Then we're trying to parse out some of the things as people age. But I think you make all great points and things that we're definitely planning to dig into more. So thank you for your comments.
By that, thank you so much for all the three. We're very wonderful paper. We have the common theme of age in a sense, but three very different perspective, right? From Bryce from Michigan State University's signaling role, and he dissected into detailed how signaling, can impact the early career job loss. Very interesting econ paper. And we have Joseph from University of Alberta, and talking about Alberta case study, or actually a good example on minimum wage policy, particularly in terms of the impacts on employment. And this paper dissecting into wage, age, and places to see the impact from minimum wage before and after the minimum wage policy implementation. So it's very interesting. And the third paper from Kathleen from GAO, talking about income inequality for people at an older age with quite some disparity we observe. Thank you so very much for three very interesting paper. I learned a lot from this, and very nice to meeting you all. I think we have to give the room to the session number 2. Thank you so much for everybody responding to my email. Also very, very nice and timely done for all the wonderful job. Thanks a lot. And thanks for the comments. Thank you, Reed, for your questions and everybody participating.